Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stCenturyWire.com. Thank you so much for rejoining us. We're here still in the first hour, and before I introduce our next guest, we've got a couple of things we want to share with you. The first is our shout poll. We still have the same shout poll up from last week. Thank you, everybody who voted and commented. It's pretty much a dead heat, 50%. I think we've had over 600 votes so far. And it's kind of a passive-aggressive rhetorical question. Which U.S. oligarchical political family is more corrupt, the Bushes or the Clintons? Now, some people might laugh at that as a sort of a softball poll, but it's just really kind of to stimulate some debate. But that shout poll, it's pretty much running 50-50 right now. So get in and vote. There's a link to it on the show page, and comment as well in that poll. And thank you for everyone who's participated in that poll. Now, we're going to play a clip, and this is from the BBC. And before I introduce our next guest, I want you to take a close listen to this. And we'll leave the mic open as well, because I'll come in about halfway through. But go ahead, and this is from the BBC. This is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos on the BBC just recently, making some very important salient points. Roll it.
Well, with me now is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First and an expert on Russia. Do you think this country is Russophobic?
What can I say, first of all? The House of Commons debate demonstrated just how MPs are deluded, uninformed and, quite frankly, biased when it comes to the conflict in Syria. And the only people who are benefiting from that ignorance and delusion are Islamist terrorists in Aleppo and elsewhere in Syria. And we must remember that those Islamist terrorists who are receiving the backing of the West pose a terrible threat to the British public, and they want to carry out scores of London-style bombings. But when we talk about Russophobia, certainly Russophobia, racism towards Russia, has a long history in Britain. It goes back even to the Crimean War, and it was there during the First World War and even during the Second World War. And Boris Johnson's comments, his call for protests outside the Russian embassy, not only contravene diplomatic protocols, but they're, quite frankly speaking, they're very dangerous, because they are encouraging hostility towards the Russian diplomats and the Russian diplomats' families. And if any harm comes to a Russian diplomat or his or her wife or husband, then Boris Johnson ultimately will be responsible.
It was interesting yesterday, just after Boris Johnson made those comments.
Okay, so that was the BBC. That was Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, and he is a PhD, a doctor, got his doctorate from the University of London, Royal Holloway College, and he's also the founder and editor of Politics First publication. There's a link to that on the show page right now. You can go ahead and see Marcus's work there, and we want to welcome him this week to the Sunday Wire. Hello, Marcus.
Good evening, Patrick, and can I say what a pleasure it is to be on your show?
No, it's a pleasure. Pleasure is all ours, Marcus, especially because of what's going on right now. I thought you're someone who's very well suited to comment on the number of things that are going on simultaneously right now in the world. And we're going to talk about the U.S. elections. But just, you know, the thing about Russia, the Russia hysteria that's going on, I know you've been tracking this for quite some time. It's just gone off the radar. It's gone into orbit here in the United States to levels that maybe almost exceed the Cold War Red Scare levels. But it's got a little bit of a Hollywood shine to it this time. But in the UK, same thing. I saw there was loads of mannequins piled up against the fence of the Russian embassy by a group called the Syria Campaign. And Boris Johnson's comments, I don't know really where to start on this, but I mean, can you believe that you're seeing this in your lifetime is my question.
Can I believe I'm seeing it in my lifetime? Yes, I can. I think anyone who is well-versed in Anglo-Russian relations will understand that Russophobia, racism towards Russians, is embedded within Whitehall and within Westminster. And it has been embedded ever since diplomatic relations were established between London and Moscow in the 1500s. And a key element of that racism towards Russians in Britain is a sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority and a view that Slavs, which of course the Russians are inherently barbaric and are inherently dangerous and violent. And we have seen this, as I said, from the 1500s all the way through to the Crimean War, the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War. And it might have dipped during the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, because, of course, Boris Yeltsin was a subservient, treacherous Russian leader, subservient to the West, but it was always there. And now we see Russia under Vladimir Putin having regained a lot of its lost superpower status. And of course, that combined with how Western power, American power, British power is on the decline, though it's not going to collapse, it will remain formidable, but nonetheless, it is on the decline. If you combine that with how Russia has regained, as I said, a lot of its lost superpower status, we can start to see why there is so much trepidation, so much fear within London and Washington over Russia, because the American and British governments understand that Russia is the only country in the world which can challenge Western global hegemony.
And you mentioned that it goes all the way back to the Crimean War. I think that's really something,
and beyond,
but especially because that was a very costly war for Britain in terms of men lost, and for for Russia as well. But yes. When Crimea, what I like to call when Crimea was reunified with Russia, I know in the West they like to say that Russia annexed Crimea, but in reality, I think it was more of a unification if you look at history. But that seemed to me that really broke. That was a straw that broke the camel's back in terms of Western punditry and the political establishment. And so you can see those wounds and those scars go all the way back. They've constantly wanted to keep Russia from having any alliances with the Ottoman Empire or with anything. And breaking the Eurasian sort of land bridge geopolitically, that was really significant. What happened with the Crimea, and that seems to me the rallying cry. Still, I hear Russia annexed Crimea. Russia, Joe Biden or whoever's repeating this talking point over and over. It's the one thing they cannot accept.
Well, if I can just very quickly jump in there, Patrick. Of course, the Crimean War was fought by Britain and, of course, France to prevent Russia expanding, or to prevent a perceived Russian expansion of power into the Black Sea and in the Balkans. And at the same time, London and Paris wanted to enclose Russia. They wanted to keep them away from the Mediterranean, keep them away from the Black Sea. So we can say a cordon sanitaire. Now, fast forward to 2016, a cordon sanitaire is being placed on Russia's western borders in the form of NATO's presence on Russia's western borders, and also the American missile defense shield, which went active this summer, and components of which are in Romania and Poland. So the West has for centuries been attempting to enclose Russia and weaken Russia by placing a cordon sanitaire around it. That's what the Crimean War essentially was about, and that's what we see in Eastern Europe today, but in the form of an American missile defense shield and NATO's presence there.
And when we say Crimean War, that we're talking about the 19th century for anybody who's listening.
Yes.
There was no war for the Crimea 2 years ago, despite what all the U.S. networks have said. I'm still at pains to find out when and where Russia invaded the Ukraine. That I'm still looking for, because I keep being told this has happened over and over by everybody from the U.S. president all the way down. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So. When you hear all this sort of stuff, I mean, you mentioned the sort of the ignorance of people in Parliament. I listened to some of these debates, especially in the eve of the Syria war vote last November, and to see one MP queued up after another, from Hillary Benn and all the rest of that lot in the Labour Party, especially. I was shocked at people are just getting up and just reading off anything that might resemble facts or that they believe happened, or it's just a battle of narratives coming from 100 different directions. I mean, what happened to any sort of validating facts and academic study and, being very careful with what you say in public? That seems to have all gone out the window, Marcus, now.
Well, that debate about a year ago in the House of Commons about whether Britain should start bombing ISIS in Syria reflected the dreadful level of ignorance concerning what is happening in Syria, and it also demonstrated the low caliber in politics at the moment. I mean, you pick up Patrick on Hillary Benn and other people in the Labour Party. Well, for most people in the Labour movement, that was a very, very depressing debate because Labour MPs, by and large, voted for Britain to start bombing ISIS in Syria. And we must never forget that there is a sharp, acute divide between the parliamentary Labour Party and the Labour movement. Most Labour MPs are either to the right of the party or centre-left, which is very, very similar to the right of the party. And that is down to Tony Blair. When Tony Blair became leader in 1994 of the Labour Party, he changed the selection process for Labour candidates because he wanted to root out left-wing candidates. So prior to Tony Blair, once a local Labour Party nominated a candidate to stand in a general election, that was it. But after Tony Blair, those candidates had to go before a panel in London made up of right-wingers, and of course that panel would pick out left-wingers, and they would ensure that only right-wing candidates went into the general elections. But going back to that debate, yes, I mean, there was no evidence put forward in it, there was no intellect shown, and it was ludicrous from another perspective as well, because we were hearing about how Britain was going to go to war with ISIS, and then the next day on the front covers of the newspapers, the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Daily Express, Britain declares war on ISIS. Well, I mean, how can Britain declare war on ISIS when it's deploying 6 aircraft to bomb ISIS in Syria? I mean, so this is the bewildering, perplexing nature of many British parliamentarians. I mean, as I said, it's absolutely ludicrous. And that vote last year was not really about military action. It was symbolism for Britain to show political and moral support to America. Now, if we fast forward to the recent debate in Syria, in the House of Commons, about the Russian military campaign in Syria, once again we heard a number of MPs, in particular Conservative MPs, calling for the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy to start shooting down Russian aircraft in Syria. Well, I was watching that debate in the press gallery, because I'm a member of the press gallery of the House of Commons, and the first thing that came to my mind was, well, in Syria, Syria has some of the most potent, formidable air defense systems in the world, possibly the most effective, operated by the Syrian military and the Russian military, the S-300, the S-400, the Pantsir. Now, how are British aircraft going to penetrate those air defense systems? It's not going to happen. And if Royal Navy ships in the Eastern Mediterranean fire cruise missiles, they would have to penetrate those air defense systems. So from a military point of view, what those British MPs were saying recently was just nonsensical. And of course, the only military in the world that could penetrate the air defense systems in Syria would be the American military, but it would have to be wave after wave after wave of American aircraft and cruise missiles. And of course, how many American aircraft would be destroyed? How many pilots would be killed? And that's why the Americans are not going to do it. But returning to the House of Commons, it was a nonsensical debate, and I think it once again reiterated this Anglo-Saxon sense of superiority, which is very prevalent at Westminster, and it showed also how so many British MPs, they live in cloud cuckoo land.
Yeah, well, the sense of exceptionalism, and
Yes.
it's something that we can relate to here in America as well. There is an inherent cultural sense of exceptionalism, especially when projecting one's power globally, and so with Boris Johnson, and I just looked at his appointment to the foreign secretary position as one of the first acts of the newly unelected Prime Minister Theresa May this past summer, and I thought that was very telling for me, because I thought this is one of her first big decisions, and then she puts a man like Boris Johnson into the foreign secretary position, and that says a lot about this current administration. I'll call it administration, but the May government, as it were, but they're not governing, so they can't be a government, in my opinion, anyway. The May administration. To put Boris Johnson as foreign secretary is kind of like sending a message that we're going to have a dysfunctional foreign policy. We're going to be very bullshy in our communications. We're going to be shooting from the hip and all these things. What else could it be with Boris in there?
I think that there were internal Conservative Party factors at play. I think Theresa May put him in the role of Foreign Secretary to appease the right wing of her party. And I think that Theresa May put him in that position as a way of saying, OK, Boris, you've got a lot of support within the Conservative Party. You're very popular at Parliament. You're very popular within the grassroots of the Conservative Party. You have a lot to say. I'm going to put you in a senior position, the most senior position you've ever held in your life. If you make it, great. If you don't, that's your own fault, and that's the end. And I think that would be a way of Theresa May establishing her power, her control in the government. But it was it remains a very dangerous tactic, because here we have a foreign secretary who has broken all diplomatic protocols by calling for protests outside the Russian embassy, and it would be the same if he called for protests outside any other embassy.
Exactly.
And we have someone who, once again, hasn't really lived in the real world. He's had a very, very privileged upbringing, and he often talks about his political credentials, including the fact he speaks ancient Greek. And he is now Foreign Secretary, and he is contributing to the ever worsening, deteriorating relations between Britain and Russia, and as a result, between America and Russia. And I find it quite ironic how a lot of people in the British mainstream media, they criticise Jeremy Corbyn for his image, for the way he dresses, for his suit, because he wouldn't represent Britain well on the international stage. Well, look at Boris Johnson, not just in terms of his image, but look at his reckless behaviour. Look at his reckless words. This is not someone that should be representing Britain at the United Nations, in Moscow, in Paris, in Berlin, etc., etc. You know, once again, it serves to demonstrate how the calibre in British politics is very, very low. You can go back, for example, just before the Falklands War, and who was Margaret Thatcher's Foreign Secretary? Lord Peter Carrington. Now, put politics aside, these were heavyweights. These were real intellects. These were people who really had a lot of experience, tremendous experience of the world. And they had a strong reputation for thinking before they spoke. Today, we don't have that in British politics. And it's not just damaging for Britain's reputation in the world, but it's damaging for the United Nations as a whole.
And do you think this is kind of an overarching trend? I've noticed this, during the Tony Blair, the Blair Brown governments, that politics turned into kind of a celebrity affair. And it was never like that in Britain, from when I first lived in the country in 1991 and forward. I noticed this change during Tony Blair. Yes. And the celebritization of politics, and also in the United States, this really came in with Bill Clinton. Both of those are kind of those two vanguards kind of move forward simultaneously. And then from there, it changed. I think the people's relationship with government is changing. The intermediary seems to be the media now in a much bigger way than before. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I would agree with what you've just said. I think that owing to Britain's special relationship with America, it makes Britain very susceptible to American influence, be it political influence, be it economic influence, be it influence from a society perspective, and in general. And there's an old saying, isn't there? America's problems today are Britain's problems tomorrow. And there's no question about it that while image has always been present in British politics, it has become such a massive factor today. And I can only put that down to the American influence. There is a real lack of intellect on the front benches in the House of Commons. There is a real lack of experience, and I mean experience of the real world. And it is, in general elections, for example, it's more about sound bites. It's more about who's able to give a perfectly polished presentation during a television debate. And look how many people become MPs today. They graduate from university, they work at either Conservative Party head office or Labour Party head office, or they work for a Labour MP or a Conservative MP, and then, lo and behold, they become nominated as prospective parliamentary candidates, and they enter Parliament without barely any experience of the real world. So it's quite inevitable that British politics is or does have a very, very low caliber at the moment because of that image influence from America, and also because that translates into journalists being more interested in, as I said, a perfectly polished speech, and what they're wearing and where they go to eat and what they drink, as opposed to hearing policies and substantial policies.
And so in America, obviously, this is on a whole nother scale in terms of the size of that whole the show business aspect of politics, which we're seeing now again in a much bigger way this election cycle than ever before. And I think the next election cycle will be even more, and so forth. Probably Kanye West will run for president in 4 years. But so how are you viewing this? I know you've got your finger on the pulse of, what the British press and what the political bodies and people are thinking and looking over at the United States election. How is this being viewed right now, this contest? What are some of the main impressions that are being conveyed from the U.S. elections in Britain and Europe in general?
I think there is a very strong view, and I share the view, that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton probably constitute the worst presidential candidates in modern American political history. I view the pair of them as appalling candidates, and even more appalling human beings. And I suspect that Hillary Clinton is even worse. And there are many things we can say about this election. One of them is that you have two candidates. One is a billionaire, the other one is a multimillionaire. Now, that to me constitutes a serious problem. How about having a candidate who is not entrenched in wealth? How about someone from an ordinary background who has lived an ordinary life, who has encountered many of life's problems, trying to survive on a day-to-day basis with a job, with a family and a salary, and yet you have a billionaire and a multi-millionaire? That's not healthy for any democracy in the world. And then it's once again the lack of intellect of the pair of them, the lack of respectability of the pair of them, the way they conduct themselves, be it during those election debates, on television, at their rallies. I mean, this is a really dreadful campaign. You know, I did watch segments of those 3 debates. I think there were 3 debates, if I'm right.
Yeah, there were 3. Yeah,
there were 3 debates, and I saw Donald Trump walking about on the stage, acting like a bully boy, and then I saw Hillary Clinton, who just reeks with deceitfulness. And when she was taking questions from the audience, she was behaving in such an obsequious manner to these people. There's no credibility to either of them. And do you know, Patrick, in recent weeks, I just happened to go back to the debates during the 1988 American presidential election between George Bush Sr. and Michael Dukakis, and that's not so long ago. And once again, that was a very bitter campaign. And once again, putting politics aside, just have a look at those 2 debates. They were serious. There was intellect present. They were respectful. Policies were cited, and substance was given to those policies by both candidates. Now, shoot forward to these 2, and you don't have any of that. So I'm inclined to say, in my humble opinion, that George Bush Jr., Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton are the worst candidates for an American presidential election, certainly in my lifetime, and I suspect at least in the 20th century. And the other point I would make about Donald Trump is that he's never held elected office before. How can you have someone running for the president of America, or the president of any country in the world, or prime minister of any country in the world, if they haven't held elected office before? No. American democracy is not to be idolized. It's not to be looked to for an example. It's actually to be viewed as what a democracy should not be about. It should not be about billions of dollars and millions of dollars and billionaires and multi-millionaires and bully boys and deceitful people. And Hillary Clinton, one of the frustrating points for me that hasn't been picked up in the British mainstream media was her role as Secretary of State in regard to Libya and in regard to Syria. And I think she's a malicious individual. I remember when she announced that there would be NATO had started bombing the forces in Libya loyal to Colonel Gaddafi. She finished the statement. She was in Paris, and she looked at the reporters and she said, "Right, let's party. We're in gay Paris." And, I mean, to me, that was absolutely shocking. And then when Colonel Gaddafi was murdered, and I'm not saying I liked him. I think he was a terrible human being, but he was the legitimate leader of Libya, and that's all that matters, in my opinion. But she made that dreadful comment, and correct me, maybe, Patrick, if I get this wrong, but she said something along the lines of, "We came, we conquered, he died."
Yeah, we came, we saw, he died. So
right.
I think we've got that on our clipboard. Have you got that, Hesher, on fast dial? I'm not sure.
I only have the one with all the techno beats on it. I don't know if you want to go that far.
No, we'll play that at the end of the show.
All right.
They did a dance remix of that, Marcus, by the way. They did a house remix of that Hillary Clinton sound. It's very nice.
The Secretary of State to make a comment like that, completely unacceptable. But also, from a human perspective, what human being laughs at the death of another human being? You tell me.
Yeah, it's very disturbing to listen to. I'm going to add to your list of prohibitions for qualifying candidates. You said, billionaires and multimillionaires. I'll also throw in there, in America, it's all lawyers. Maybe the only saving grace of Donald Trump is that he's not a lawyer, but he's the only one. It literally every single in the Republican field and in the Democratic field, they're all lawyers basically. Well, there was no Democratic field, but that's another story.
It's very interesting to hear.
But the lawyers seem to have taken over politics, and I think they're all well qualified in the distinct category, as one can imagine. But this is also a problem, is that you have to be in a law firm to also make your way into political life as well as the track that you mentioned before.
And don't forget, Tony Blair was a lawyer.
He was, and so was his lovely doting wife as well.
That's right. Well, she's a judge now. I mean, Tony was a barrister, and his wife was a barrister QC, and now she's a judge, High Court judge.
Judge Blair, yeah, Booth, Sherry Booth Blair.
Yeah.
So, but further than that, in terms of the public perception of this is Donald Trump ran. There was a field of 15 Republican candidates, and so this was kind of a strange and unprecedented mandate that he had on the right from voters, and he romped on the primaries against what they thought at first would be the most competitive field ever that they were saying in the GOP. Donald Trump romped home with the nomination, despite having the media against him and so forth, and all the establishment, the RNC, Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, the speaker, all the Never Trump, John McCain, all the rest of them. So in a way, this was kind of the voters saying, we roundly reject career politicians, and as like the old joke that if Mickey Mouse is on the ballot, he's going to get a couple of million votes a year on every election. Donald Trump really was that Mickey Mouse character in the primaries, and now it's developed into something else. And the other side, you have Corella DeVille, and who ran unopposed essentially. I don't count Bernie Sanders because that seemed to be a stitch up from the beginning. But so this is to me, it's a very dangerous place. It's definitely a break from the past in terms of politics, like you said. But going forward, it's almost like it's kind of like anything goes right now. We're entering a kind of weird political paradigm in America where it's potentially anything can go. Michelle Obama will most certainly, if Trump wins, or even Clinton, she'll be running within 4 or 8 years, because it seems to be this dynastic, hereditary political branding in America that seems to be the dominant paradigm. And that would go for the Trump children as well if Donald Trump wins. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I credit Trump and I respect Trump for one thing. He's honest. He's brutally honest. He's brutally candid. And I think that is very important in politics. And I think a lot of Americans appreciate a politician being honest. No matter how brutally honest it is, at least you know where you stand with someone. And I think that's why in Britain a lot of people are fed up with politicians in general, because they, generally speaking, say very similar things. They conceal a lot of their views, and I think that a percentage of the British public appreciate Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, for being honest, for being candid, for someone who, since having been elected to Parliament in 1983, has been totally open with their views, has never compromised their views, has never changed their views. And I think people appreciate that. And I think, returning to Donald Trump, I can understand why people would turn to him as opposed to Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton is very, very vague on policies. She's very vague in generally everything that she says. Whereas with Donald Trump, you know where you stand with him. Now, I think what he says is populist. I think it lacks intellect. But do I sympathise when people say, well, Marcus, I would support Donald Trump because he's totally honest? Well, my answer is yes, I understand that and I sympathise. And I would wish more politicians in America were as open and as candid as Trump, and I would wish more politicians in Britain were as open and candid as Jeremy Corbyn is.
Corbyn, he reminds me definitely of an old school politician, and even if you don't agree with Jeremy Corbyn's stances or policies, or if you think he's too far to the left, you can't debate that he's a man of integrity because he has stuck to his guns. And that, in terms of leadership qualities, and this is something that I really believe, if you're consistent, even if it's way off on the extremes, but in terms of leadership is a requirement. To be a head of state, you got to have, ideally you want to have some leadership ability, and if you want to have the people behind you, so Corbyn has that, absolutely has that, and some conviction as well. Cameron has that to some degree too. I don't give him a lot of credit on many things, but I will say that the only thing that he did that really impressed me was when he lost the Syria war vote in August 2013. He basically said, "I respect the vote of this House, and that's it. End of story." You could see that he accepted defeat, and he did it. He didn't throw a temper tantrum on the floor of the House like Michael Gove did.
Yes.
So two different characters there. And so when Michael Gove was going for the leadership run, I was laughing, saying this must be a joke or something. Back in May, they were putting him up as a potential leader of the Conservative Party. But so this thing, the character issue is really important. And like you said, the caliber is very low right now in terms of the entry point. I think if you're Machiavellian, you go really far quickly in politics. But that doesn't mean you've got character or leadership ability.
Absolutely. That doesn't mean that your constituents are going to benefit, and if you take on a role within the government or within the opposition, that doesn't mean that the country is going to benefit. In my opinion, it actually tends to mean the complete opposite.
And getting back to the other effect, I think that we might be looking at, and tell me what your opinion is on this, because I think you're very well suited to comment on this. There is a potential situation that has developed over the last couple of years as the alternative media, as social media, as there's people gathering news and having interactions on a platform that's not linear. In other words, in Britain, it's the BBC and ITV. Before, they had a monopoly on everyone's thoughts and dialogue and national conversation. And in America, it's ABC, CBS, CNN, etc. Now we have a situation where we have the establishment, the political establishment, and the media establishment seem to be huddled together. We've seen this in America. I think there's some similarities in Britain too. So there's two different conversations, one on the street and one in the working man's halls and the pubs and just general communities. And then you have the establishment conversation, which they're churning constantly. And so could we have a situation in the election in 3 days in America very similar to what you experienced and what I experienced in Britain this summer with the Brexit vote, where everyone was saying 10 points in every poll that's going to remain. No, don't worry, we're not leaving Europe. People won't. It's a done deal, and then the results come, and it's 3 or 3.5% or margin leaving the EU. So the Brexit took the day, a total surprise, because the pollsters, the media establishment, the political establishment was saying one thing, the people thought another thing. Could we have the same situation here in the United States with the Trump effect? Could the Brexit effect be transferred to the Trump effect?
Well, I think that if we take Britain for starters, opinion polls have demonstrated in recent years that they are just opinion polls, and we shouldn't attach too much importance to them. And I think that many British people, and I suspect many American people as well, they want to give a bloody nose to their respective establishments, the American establishment, the British establishment. In Britain, that really stems from the expenses scandal, which erupted in the summer of 2009. And I think that this growing public awareness in America and in Britain that there is a very large detachment between the elite and ordinary people, that awareness is really down to the fact that today in 2016 we have alternative media sources. So we have programs like your one, Patrick. We have Russia Today. We have Press TV. We have social media. And that was all lacking in the 1990s. And why do I home in on the 1990s? Because that was a very, very important period in history. That explains everything we are seeing today in the world in regard to how America and its allies, Britain in particular, is behaving. Because after the Soviet Union collapsed, America was the only superpower, and it saw a golden opportunity to become the leading power in the world and to sideline all others and to crush all potential rivals. So we have the involvement in the former Yugoslavia, and then we have Afghanistan, and then we have Iraq and Libya, and so on and so on. But you see, people weren't questioning what was happening in the 1990s because we didn't have programs like your one. We didn't have social media. But that's all changed. Western media is not the force that it once was. It is still the dominant force, regrettably, but it is a weakened dominant force. And I think that explains why, partly that explains why, if we turn to America, Donald Trump has a lot of support. Because, as you say, he's not from the political establishment, but I would say he's from the establishment in general, because the American establishment, the British establishment, it's not just the political and military and intelligence circles, it's also the business circles as well. So Donald Trump is part of the American establishment, but he's not from the political establishment. And so I think that this Tuesday is anyone's game, and I just would not be surprised, even though I think Trump is behind by a couple of points at the moment in the opinion polls. I just wouldn't be surprised if he's crowned as president the following morning, because there is a growing awareness in America of the divide between the political establishment and ordinary people, and I think ordinary people in America feel this is an opportunity to have someone that talks like the everyday person running the show, and he can't do any worse than previous presidents. For example, George Bush Jr. I'm referring to.
Yeah, I compare those two. Pretty well. Pretty good comparisons. Maybe Trump even has more political experience than George Bush Jr. did when he came into office. Yeah. And he had never been outside the United States, or from what I gathered, he hadn't traveled internationally.
I think he went to Mexico. He went
to Cabo San Lucas for some tequila shots, maybe during spring break. But so it will be if a Trump did carry the vote, it would be unprecedented. In terms of that, and of course, the country's going to be divided as well. But if Hillary Clinton takes the day, this will be a divided House and a divided country as well. So either way, I think we're in for a really rough ride over the next 12 months. And I'm going to play this. This is from Pat Cadell. Now, he was active during the Watergate investigation, and so he's an old hand in the U.S. Media, press, and political scene, Washington D.C. So we're going to play this Pat Cadell clip. Let's listen closely to what he says. So he's really talking from that perspective, looking at what would happen if Clinton was crowned in January. Go ahead and roll this clip. Listen to this.
I think the problem is I went through Watergate. I was the youngest person on Richard Nixon's enemies list. I think I may be the oldest on Hillary's at the moment. But leaving that aside, I think that what we learned is that presidency was consumed when Watergate exploded. This has already exploded. We're talking about someone, and I think American people, if they think about it, will have a huge impact, because if the day she's elected, this crisis starts. It will not go away. It's not going away unless she pardons herself, or the president, if Obama pardons her, which would blow the country wide open.
So we will be more divided than ever before.
And nothing will happen.
Be paralyzed.
And nothing will happen. The country in a moment of crisis. So that's really the choice. This will all be about her and the Clintons. And what I agree with the governor. I mean, my God, what you're seeing here is a criminal enterprise, really. And we all know the foundation was always much worse. And it is about money, and it's about many things. But you know what, most of all, the country is tired of corruption. And the word that is not allowed to be spoken inside the Beltway and by the political elites is corruption. And the country, you've got over 80-some% of people believe that they're corrupt.
Okay, so that's interesting. We talk in America a lot about regime change in various countries and the need to tackle corruption in the Sudan and Syria, and how Russia's corrupt and Putin's corrupt. I hear every minute of every day in our national conversation, but very little conversation. It's not pleasant to talk about corruption in your own country, is what I'm saying, And so we have a boiling point. This is like, how much can you contain? I don't know if you followed the Podesta emails with WikiLeaks, but it's endless, and it's almost like where do you start? And it's a rare glimpse that Julian Assange has given the public at large, given them a rare glimpse into what happens behind the curtain, and a lot of people are horrified by it. And many people I know are still in shock. They literally can't comment on it. It hasn't died, it hasn't settled yet in their brains. How are you guys seeing this? Because you're talking about basically while she was Secretary of State, the office was up for sale to Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and they had knowledge that they were funding ISIS. That came out in one of the emails too a couple of months ago. So I don't know. It's going to be a tough road ahead for a Clinton presidency.
How can I approach this? I think it's quite clear that Hillary Clinton is corrupt in more ways than one. For example, the Clinton Foundation. I would also say that corrupt has a wide meaning. I would say that both Clinton and Trump are morally corrupt people as well. And I think that a lot of people in Britain, misguided, but they did used to view America as a reliable country in the world, as a country which could sort out problems, which could help to re-establish stability in various parts of the world. Now, that was misguided, but I think that in recent years, in particular, obviously since George Bush, a lot of British people have started to view America very differently, and that is in part due to alternative media outlets and due to social media. And I think that Hillary Clinton, but also Donald Trump, is enhancing that view, that different take now of America that many British people hold. But I think we should be, I think we should be fair to Hillary Clinton, and I don't mean that in a sympathetic way, because I think she's a loathsome human being. But corruption didn't begin with her. I mean, we can go back to the Ronald Reagan presidency, and we can see what was happening there. For example, with Iran and the American army officer, and I've forgotten his name,
Oliver North.
Oliver North. There are many precedents for this in American politics. And the reality is that America is not a guardian of democracy and freedom and the rule of law and human rights. Quite frankly, that is an untenable argument. And in reality, it's the complete opposite. And I try to make this point as much as possible. If the Americans were sincerely committed to democracy and the rule of law and freedom and human rights, then it would not have such a close strategic relationship and friendship with Saudi Arabia. And in my estimation, Saudi Arabia is the most despicable, the most wicked country in the world today with what it does to its own people.
Oh, and they've spread their money around Washington in recent years too, and money buys influence.
Yes,
money buys influence. They building buildings for top universities, Ivy League universities, new schools of this, schools of that, and that goes a long way in terms of buying influence in Washington. Israel has proven, how important it is to spread the money around if you want to get a favorable point of view on all things relating to your country. Certainly, they've done that. Saudi Arabia has learned from Israel, in my opinion. So that both of them actually. Before it's like we've got more problems in America. Before it was just the Israeli lobby. Now we've got the GCC lobby as well. So it's tough.
And whoever becomes president this Tuesday will fall under the influence of, for example, Saudi Arabia. I'm quite concerned about how some people, for example, in Britain, are saying that Trump would pursue a completely different foreign policy towards Russia and towards Syria. Well, these are the same people that said that Boris Johnson would pursue a more constructive approach towards Russia and towards Syria. So I think there's a lot of naivety surrounding Donald Trump. Yes, I believe Hillary Clinton, in terms of foreign policy, would be worse for world peace, for world stability. Yes, I do believe that. But Donald Trump would be bad. He's already made it very clear that he regards Iran as a terrorist state. He's already made it very clear that he wants to establish a hardline policy towards Cuba. Now, that's hardly conducive to world peace. And both Cuba and Iran have very close relations with Russia. Now, logic dictates that if he becomes president and he goes for Iran and he goes for Cuba, that is going to bring him into conflict with Russia.
It's kind of a bric-a-brac. Trump's foreign policy kind of reflects his so-called advisors, or the people around him, and it's just a hodgepodge of God knows who. Everyone's throwing their little bit in there, so it's completely inconsistent. And it's Cuba, trying to win. He needs to win Florida, basically.
Yes.
So I'm not surprised about that coming out. But the Russia thing, that's really important to many people. For me, that's very important to de-escalate the anti-Russian rhetoric. Because I think this is a very dangerous road for society to go down, because it can also be used to justify all kinds of wars. Plus, we have the situation in Syria. But so, in terms of Trump's foreign policy, he's also in the pocket of Israel. He's very much Sheldon Adelson is 100% behind Donald Trump.
Yes.
But the two of them, speak the same language. They're in the same business, of course. But Trump did a major pivot on the Israeli-Palestinian issue midway through the primaries. And so then the Israeli support came flowing in after that. And so, but he did attract a lot of people early on by saying he'd like to see peace, a peace deal struck in Palestine. That attracted a lot of libertarians and people over to his camp. And then he pivoted away from that, which disappointed a lot of people. But my thing is this, and I'll hand it back over to you, Marcus. But you have Donald Trump, who's basically a private citizen, businessman, no experience in politics. But then you have Hillary Clinton in public office as a public servant, and so I'm more critical of her because I can be, because she's got more on the record than Trump. He's lucky because he doesn't have a whole lot on the record, but I do put the caveat out: if Donald Trump becomes president, I will be equally as tough on him, his policies and his actions in public office. And I think with the press, it's become so partisan, the media, that Hillary Clinton's not getting any level of interrogation from the mainstream media on any of this stuff. She's only getting it from the sort of the right wing. So it's almost like you could get away with anything, and then your partisan media surrogates are going to be like, no problem, we're still behind you. You know what I mean? That's kind of the realm that we're in now in the West. Very partisan in terms of media surrogates.
Yes, I think once again that comes back to how Trump is not. He's not a part of Capitol Hill, and a lot of Americans, ordinary Americans, who have to live their lives day by day, have a great deal of anger towards people on Capitol Hill, and quite rightly so. And I think that is how that is one of Donald Trump's strengths. But then we need to talk about in relativity terms. It's one of his strengths. Well, yes, that explains why people are supporting him. But still, Patrick, when I vote for someone because they have they have substantial policies, they have intellect, they have a great deal of experience, they know how to conduct themselves. Now, I hold the view, and I can't see how there's an alternative view, that Donald Trump doesn't have any of those. And I don't think Hillary Clinton doesn't have any of those either. And so I do worry that there will be an election, a presidential election this Tuesday, and a lot of Americans, a lot of people will vote for a candidate because they simply are not part of of Washington's corridors of power. As I said earlier, I can understand why people take that line, but it's a dangerous line as well, because you have to judge someone on a number of things, and they have to be the complete package. Take Margaret Thatcher. She was the complete package, and I'm certainly not saying I admired her, but she was the complete package. We can talk about Tony Blair in '97. Once again, I'm certainly not saying I admire him, but he was the complete package.
He was at the time, yeah. He was like the mercurial. He was like this was the future. He really came out like a sprite. You're correct, absolutely.
He did, and I think it shows that there's a very, very serious situation in America at the moment in the context of politics, whereby we have two candidates who really are not fit for office. I don't think they're fit to be senator or governor. I don't think they're fit to be vice president. And I think it's extremely alarming that two people of their nature are running for the White House, and one of them is going to be president. I think that we should all be alarmed at that. And I'm not meaning to come across as being melodramatic, but I think it is alarming. I said it was alarming when George Bush became president. Bush Jr. became president, and we know what happened under his presidency.
Yeah, look what he got up to. Yeah, record speaks for itself. So, I think America, I think Western society as a whole, I don't think this is an exaggeration. I think we're at a crossroads right now, where old paradigms are clashing with intermediary, transitional paradigms, and a lot of people, it's very difficult to know what's going to come out the other end. That sort of the predictability is not there, and I think this is what scares a lot of people. This is the cause for a lot of trepidation. They really don't know. So people will do in this situation, Marcus, people will do one of two things. They'll either flee to something that's safe, something they know, or they're going to, a vanguard will come in and want to basically smash up and redefine and rebuild, the entire system on that basis. So that's the struggle. I think Hillary Clinton, to me, represents maybe the old traditional system of politics, and somehow Trump, maybe he's not the best vehicle for it. Certainly not. But he represents that new vanguard, and these two things can't always coexist peacefully. And this is the fear many people are going to have, that either way, whatever the result is going to be, there's going to be some level of social unrest in the United States, and we already saw bits of it over the last 4 years and before, but that's the big fear. So it's going to be very hard for a lot of people to swallow the result on this in 3 days.
Yeah, and it's a legitimate fear to have, and I really would. I think in the short term, I would hold both candidates responsible for having contributed to that. But I think this goes back a long way, and I think that, in my view, it really took a hold under Bill Clinton. That's when I would really trace it to. Yes, we had instances with George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan and so forth, Richard Nixon, but there was something about the Bill Clinton presidency which was particularly dangerous for America, and especially dangerous for the world. And we all know that humanitarian intervention became the leading aspect of Bill Clinton's foreign policy, and that explains why today we have the situation in Syria, with the situation in Iraq, and the situation in Libya, and also a diabolical situation in Kosovo as well.
Yeah, well, this will probably be one of my final points here in this segment. But to me, the biggest concern that I have traveling around the world is the fact that the United States seems to be, Barack Obama is absolutely a poster child for this as well, a total ignorance of international law.
Yes.
And they talk about international norms. John Kerry's always lecturing us on our values, and in Britain the same. You have your on the floor of the Parliament. I've heard this many times from Cameron and everybody else. Our values are, and we have governments, specifically Washington, London, and Paris. I'll single those three out, although there's many others I could throw in here. They're arming and funding listed, internationally recognized militant extremist terrorist groups in Syria. Okay, that's a violation of international law. Also, foreign fighters, even rebels in Syria. It's a contravention of the Geneva Conventions. That's the whole basis of the Nuremberg principles. And the United Nations itself is founded on some of these principles. That to me is the biggest threat. And so I'm looking for my leadership in the United States to say, whoa, hold on. There needs to be some agreement on international law, because right now there seems to be, they're completely going around it. The United Nations is completely corrupted. It's, I think, under the thumb of the United States mostly. But so then you have Russia trying to basically act in accordance with international law, but yet being accused of committing war crimes in Syria by British parliamentarians and others. There's a huge disconnect here. And that, to me, is the biggest danger that I see right now. Clear and present danger is that, because this could lead, we're very close to a situation where the UN could become the League of Nations if things were to escalate in the wrong way. That's my biggest fear. I'm looking for the leadership on this issue in Britain and in the US, and I'm not seeing it.
I completely concur with everything you've just said. Yes, and your last point about the United Nations becoming the League of Nations. Well, I think, if you'd asked someone 15 years ago, 20 years ago about that, they would have said no chance. But I do think there is a distinct possibility of that happening. I think that international law is, or the main violator of international law is America and its allies. It began in the former Yugoslavia. That's something that a lot of people, they're not aware of. When the West encouraged and recognized the unilateral Declaration of Independence by Slovenia, Croatia and Bosnia, that destroyed the sanctity of internationally recognized borders, which is a fundamental pillar of the UN Charter and international law in general. And then, of course, NATO bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999 without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. And that has led to, as I said, Iraq and Libya and Ukraine. Let's not forget Ukraine and Syria. And in regard to the people who the West are supporting in Syria, well, you know, Patrick, they are Islamist terrorists. They are Islamist militants. There's no question about that. But do you know what, Patrick? Even if those people fighting against the Syrian government, even if they were angels, even if they were angelic, they were whiter than white, it is still illegal to support them by any means. It is illegal under international law. It contravenes the UN Charter. And that is a point which needs to be told time and time again. Now, of course, it's all the more dangerous, it's all the more malignant, because the people receiving this support are the people, ideologically speaking, are the same people, ideologically speaking, who have carried out Islamist terrorist attacks all over the world. And, you know, they're the ones who carried out the London bombings, and they want to carry out London-style bombings up and down Britain. And the British government is supporting these people in Syria. So when David Cameron accused Jeremy Corbyn last year of being sympathetic to terrorists, I did think to myself, well, perhaps you should look in the mirror, Mr. Cameron, because you're the one who supported Islamist groups in Libya against Colonel Gaddafi, and you're the one who's supporting them in Syria against the Syrian government.
And isn't that a violation of, in America, it's absolutely, we have laws about giving material support to known terrorist groups. And that would include arming them, obviously. But in Britain, you have the same laws on the books. So is it a case we now have our governments are in violation of their own domestic laws? I'm not even talking about international, just domestic.
I would argue that there's no question about it. You know, British people in the Foreign Office or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office like to say that Britain conducts an ethical and legal foreign policy. Well, it couldn't be further from the truth, because, as you said, they are supporting illegally armed groups on the territory of an independent sovereign country whose borders are internationally recognised by all UN members. So yes, it's a contravention of international law, and it's also a contravention of British law too.
But this is where the lawyers come in, you see, because the lawyers have cleverly shifted the labels and the names of the groups. So these are moderate rebels over here. That's Free Syrian Army over there. That's al-Nusra. No. And so when you're run by lawyers, they're very good at this shell game of being basically liability, and not giving out their exposure to liability by making sure that the right name is on the contract. So we are arming. We have British Special Forces, U.S. Special Forces cohorts with terrorist groups, training them in Syria, in Jordan, in Turkey.
Yes.
And our military and contractors, but it's all the same, because we're paying someone. Well, we're paying the bill, or maybe Saudi Arabia is paying the bill. That's another story. But so that's where the problem lies. They managed to snake out of this somehow by playing around with the names of the groups. And they really go out, put a lot of effort in, go out of their way to get the labels right. I noticed politicians very, very careful how they say all these different names at different times, and I think there's a legal reason for that. So trying to protect themselves.
And journalists, of course, then take it upon themselves to spin it, or mainstream journalists take it upon themselves to spin it, because mainstream media is very much part of the establishment in Britain. For example, all mainstream media in the UK, be it broadcast or print, follows the line in terms of foreign policy of 10 Downing Street and the Foreign Office. And so it's down to mainstream media, it's down to the editors to get the support of the British public for the British government's foreign policy course, if in relation to the invasion of Iraq, in regard to the bombing of Serbia, in regard to intervention in Libya, in regard to Syria. The British politicians and, of course, the senior civil servants, the permanent undersecretaries, the people who run each government department, they're the ones who, as you say, come out with this labelling. They put this policy together. It's then spun by mainstream media. And if we just quickly return to America, do you remember in 1998, the American State Department listed the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, as a terrorist organization?
Yes.
And then at the beginning of 1999, that was dropped. That was dropped to allow the American government to openly back the Kosovo Liberation Army, and then the British government did that, and we know where that led to. But the point is that the Kosovo Liberation Army was an organised crime syndicate involved in the sex trade, the gun trade, and the drug trade. And when Kosovan Albanians started coming to Britain after 1999, it only took a few years for the Home Office, and these are not my figures now, Patrick, but for the British Home Office to say that 70% of organised crime in Britain is being run by Kosovan Albanians.
Yep.
I think that says it all, really.
They took over, basically.
I
remember in the old days, Soho was run by the Maltese, the Maltese mafia. Then after that, the Yardies took over, and then after the Yardies, the Albanians showed up.
Yeah, yes, Kosovan Albanians in particular, who of course had been part of the KLA, and this is what British taxpayers' money has been spent on: people who bring organised crime to the streets of British towns and cities. And today in Syria, British taxpayers' money is being spent on people who want to murder British civilians on British soil in cold blood. What a deplorable situation we find ourselves in today.
And this is all being done under the aegis of human rights. And there's all these human rights organizations. I've written about this in the past, and I've given lectures on it to universities, to students, talking about the human rights industry. And so all of this is being enabled by this call for human rights. We need to protect the right, the responsibility to protect. Okay.
Yes.
And so, but where are the where are the litigators? Because who is holding the government to account of breaking its laws? It seems like everyone's kind of they've glossed over the illegalities of it in favor of this new court of judgment, which is the human rights issue, seems to trump the legal responsibilities of the government. Seems to be trumped by the human rights.
Wow,
and this is the dominant theme.
Well, I mean, the human rights argument, of course, is a very clever argument that the American and British governments use to justify them pursuing their geostrategic goals in the world. It's just a cover, but the concept of humanitarian intervention wasn't invented by the West. It actually goes back to Nazi Germany. Let's not forget, leading up to the Munich conference, which eventually gave the Sudetenland to Nazi Germany, what was Hitler's argument about why the Sudetenland should come back or should be part of Germany? He named humanitarian reasons, in that ethnic Germans were being persecuted by the majority Czech population. So that was, of course, that was deceit, but that was the cover, and Hitler employed it with propaganda. And 21st century, in the 1990s, when humanitarian intervention was resurrected, the West used it, and they used it very, very decisively. They used it very decisively in Croatia, in Bosnia, and then in Kosovo. But they got away with it because there were not, at that time, alternative media outlets. There was no social media. And they can't get away with it today like how they used to. And in that, even though we live in a very dangerous world, and in a very depressing world, there is some light, there is some hope in that the West does not have that sort of power it once had. Western media doesn't have the field to itself anymore. Yes, Western media, yes, American power is going to remain formidable in the foreseeable future, but it is a weakened country. And a world in which Russia regains the power that it had in Soviet times can only mean two things, in my view: a more stable world and a more peaceful world. And in that, everyone should be rejoicing in Russia becoming stronger and stronger.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of advocates for, a multipolar world who have seen a unipolar world of the last 25 years as being absolute mayhem, total smash and grab culture in terms of geopolitics, but and shock doctrines like the Project for a New American Century and so forth. Yes. Yeah, so a multipolar world can be a healthy thing. This is a very hard sell, though, in the United States, because this idea of American exceptionalism has been ramped up to even outgrow even the idea of patriotism into sort of omnipotent world power sort of thing. And this is also new. This is again, I think this grew out of the 80s, out of the Reagan years as well. But America would like Russia to return to the 90s. They keep talking. They said it. I think Fareed Zakaria said it on CNN today. When Russian democracy was promising, he said, was in the 90s, before Putin arrived. But let me tell you, I speak to people about who were in Russia in the 90s. It was absolute mayhem.
Absolutely. And Boris Yeltsin was no Democrat. Boris Yeltsin used military force against the Russian parliament at the end of 1993, and Boris Yeltsin falsified the presidential election result in 1996. It was the communists who won that presidential election. Boris Yeltsin was no Democrat, and also Boris Yeltsin had no moral compunction in using violence to achieve his aims at home in Russia. That's something that Mikhail Gorbachev didn't have. Mikhail Gorbachev just couldn't use force. He couldn't use violence to achieve an aim. But Boris Yeltsin, he had no problem in doing that. So Russia wasn't democratic in the 1990s. Yeltsin was no Democrat at all. But he was pro-Western. He was subservient to the West. And of course, that ticked all the requirements of policymakers in Washington and also in London, we should say.
Oh, the bankers loved it too. It was a neoliberal fairground. J.P. Morgan, everybody was in there, sent their little economic advisors in there, the little Ivy League geniuses and quants, basically trying to basically suck what they could in terms of assets out of the Russian economy. Yeah, that was the glory days. This is what they hold up as the paragon of Russian democratic achievement, was the 1990s, still in America, unfortunately. But
well, then maybe they should go to Russia and say that to the average Russian person and see the response. They'd be very brave people to say that to ordinary Russians in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or anywhere else in Russia.
Yeah, well, I think it would be nice. It would be good to see good relations between the West and Russia, if not anything for the cultural exchange. I think when people go and visit and they share time in two different countries, they get grow some appreciation for the people and respect for their cultures, their customs, their food, their values. This is how you build bridges internationally, and so that's not happening right now, and sanctions is not helping either. These things need to be lifted, in my opinion, for people to move forward. And I think it'd be better for Europe, too. So I don't know what the end game is while they're maintaining this strict regime of sanctions on Russia. I don't see what the benefit is.
I think the European Union was very, under German leadership, or de facto German leadership, we should say, was very hesitant about placing sanctions on Russia in 2014. But the Americans applied the pressure, and the Germans, the Germans relented. And also Britain was putting a lot of pressure on Germany to place EU sanctions on Russia. And that's one of the intriguing aspects of Brexit, in that there are a lot of German officials and French officials who are happy to see Britain leave the European Union, because they view Britain as a troublemaker. They view Britain as acting as a Trojan horse in the EU for the Americans, constantly relaying everything back to Washington, and constantly lobbying countries in the EU on behalf of America. Now, if Britain does leave the EU, then there's a possibility, I think it's a small possibility, because America does have so much influence over Germany, but there is a possibility that an EU minus the United Kingdom could start to slightly improve relations with Russia. As I say, I agree. It's remote, but it's a possibility.
No, that's a very strong possibility, actually, because there's a lot of BMWs that are purchased in Russia every year, and Mercedes-Benz, just for starters. So Germany has lost a big trading partner there, and many other countries, Spain too, with this citrus and agriculture, and Italy. They all want to lift the sanctions. You're right. I think it's Britain and the U.S. or it's the dominant parties holding back progress in that department, but Brexit, do you think it, I said back when the vote happened, we got about a minute left, but I said that I wasn't convinced that the Conservative government was serious about leaving the European Union. I thought it was just a big Punch and Judy show. And that David Cameron's Best of Both Worlds document would be implemented, which is a renegotiated relationship with Europe. What do you think that's what's playing out now?
I know I've got a minute or something like that. Well, look, the Treasury's analysis of the consequences of Britain leaving the EU in terms of a decline in GDP, a decline in trade, I think it's true. However, Cameron and George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, they simply took a credible analysis and said that there would be economic Armageddon if Britain left the EU, which of course is ludicrous. The British economy is not going to collapse. So I think the pair of them, I think they saw the economic imperatives of Britain being in the EU. I don't like the EU for ideological and foreign policy reasons, but I do believe that the rich countries benefit, and they benefit to a large extent by exploiting the poor countries. For example, Bulgaria and Romania and Slovenia and Croatia. But I think that Osborne and Cameron understood that Britain does benefit economically, and that's why they chose to campaign for Britain to remain in the EU. But they discredited the Treasury's analysis by saying that, minutes after a Brexit decision, verdict at the referendum, there would be, as I said, economic Armageddon. Well, you simply can't say those sort of comments. They are unintelligent, and they're very, very irresponsible. And I think that was a major factor as to why the British public, the English public, we should be more precise, actually voted for the UK to leave the EU.
You're right, Dad. Good caveat. The English public, very important caveat. Well, we keep an eye on that story, Marcus, and that's certainly, I think it's going to really heat up after Christmas in the run-up to March. We'll keep an eye on that. But we really appreciate your time, Marcus, and for coming on the show. Obviously, there's a lot of things we can talk about, and we should. And we'll leave that for another time. But I just want to say thank you, and also give us a shout out to your website as well. And if you have any books that you're coming out with or anything like that, people can look out for.
I will certainly do that. I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. It's been very informative. It's been very candid, which we were both saying is important in this day and age. And I thank you once again for having kindly invited me to come onto your wonderful program.
Yep, Politics First, editor and founder, Marcus Papadopoulos. Check out his work there. There's a link on the show page. We'll see you soon, Marcus. Take care.
Thank you very much. You too.
We'll be back after this break. We'll be connecting with our next guest in a few minutes, but before that, we've got some breaking clips from the U.S. election trail we're going to share with you after the break. This is the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Stay right there.
Well, you're Captain Buck Rogers, and according to your ship's log, you left Earth in 1987.
That much I know. Tell me what I don't know.
Well, if preliminary data holds up, it appears you have returned to Earth 504 years later.